524 people were flying into disaster. The pilots lay unconscious. Nobody knew what to do. In seat 14C sat a woman nobody noticed, a woman everyone would forget. But she knew something nobody else aboard could understand. She knew how to save them. Walking toward that cockpit meant destroying everything she built to stay hidden. Some emergencies demand heroes. Some heroes refuse the role until they cannot refuse anymore. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The cabin of the Boeing 777-300ER stretches nearly 210 feet, a cathedral of aluminum and composites designed to carry humanity across oceans. Today it carries 524 souls, passengers, crew, and one woman whose presence matters more than anyone yet understands. The aircraft climbs through layers of cloud toward its cruising altitude of 37,000 feet, the engine's constant hum, a rhythm so familiar to most passengers that they've already stopped hearing it. Children settle into seats with tablets and headphones. Business travelers open laptops. An elderly couple holds hands in the window seats of row 32. Life unfolds across the fuselage as it has countless times before, routine, ordinary, proceeding according to schedules written months in advance. In seat 14C, Sarah Mitchell sits with a novel unopened on her lap, her eyes closed as if sleeping, though her breathing remains controlled and deliberate. She is 53 years old, carries a Maine driver's license, and answers to Ms. Mitchell when the flight attendants serve drinks. Nothing about her appearance suggests anything beyond ordinary, gray streaking through her dark hair, lines around her eyes that speak of either age or weariness, a wedding ring worn smooth with years of existence and absence. She wears jeans and a navy sweater. Her carry-on contains precisely what a business traveler might need. Her boarding pass shows seat assignment and nothing else. To every person aboard who might glance in her direction, she is invisible in the way that middle-aged women often become invisible, present in space but erased from notice, a person one forgets immediately after looking at. This invisibility is deliberate. Sarah was once the pilot that other pilots deferred to. She flew the 777 when it was new enough that the procedure still bore the fingerprints of its designers. She held a commercial license with ratings in every major aircraft type, accumulated over 12,000 flight hours, and carried certifications that opened doors most people never knew existed. She'd flown from seat 1, the captain's seat, managing not dozens of people but hundreds, responsible for their lives in ways that shaped every decision, every calculation, every moment of focus spanning 16-hour shifts across multiple days. She'd managed engine failures at 35,000 feet, hydraulic system cascades, weather events that rewrote themselves across radar screens, and the weight of knowing that one wrong decision meant 200 people didn't reach their destinations. She'd trained in simulators and classrooms, accumulated debriefings and incident reports, built muscle memory for emergencies that she hoped never to encounter for Raoul. Then her daughter was diagnosed with leukemia, and Sarah's ordered world fractured. The chemotherapy treatments happened on a schedule that refused to accommodate airline pairings. The hospital was in Maine. The apartment she and her daughter occupied was 2 miles away. Decisions simplified to mathematics, daughter or career. That particular math only solved one way. Sarah took early retirement from United at 48, packed their life into that small apartment, and spent 3 years learning how to be present for someone she loved without the distraction of worrying about 500-mile flight routes at 41,000 feet. The leukemia went into remission. Sarah's daughter graduated high school, then college, then moved to California to start a life that didn't include a mother who needed to debrief the details of her day over kitchen tables. Sarah was left with her pension, her qualifications, and the entire rest of her life stretching ahead with no particular destination. She chose invisibility. Sarah works occasionally for a charter company that doesn't ask many questions, enough to keep her current on aircraft systems and maintain her pilot's medical certificate. She lives quietly in Portland, attends a yoga class 3 times a week, volunteers at a maritime museum in the summers, and flies commercial as a passenger frequently enough that her retirement appears enviable rather than lonely. She reads books that nobody cares whether she finishes. She goes to movies alone. She maintains precisely enough of a life that nobody worries about her, and nobody remembers her after she's passed through their field of vision. The 777 levels off at 37,000 feet. The captain, a man named David Chen, who is on his 47th flight as captain, who has logged 8,400 hours flying 777 specifically, who called his wife from the gate in Boston and promised to be home for their daughter's soccer game, maintains his focus on the approach procedures even as fatigue from the 4-day trip settles into his shoulders. The first officer, Marcus Webb, is 34, relatively junior, and still absorbs the procedures with the kind of intense concentration that hasn't yet worn down into routine. The flight attendants move through the cabin with practiced efficiency, demonstrating oxygen masks to the few people still watching, distributing drinks and snacks, settling into the rhythm of service that makes this journey feel like any other journey. Sarah opens her novel. She reads the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing it. She closes the book again. At 37,000 feet, the 777's environmental systems manage the impossible task of creating a breathable atmosphere inside a pressure vessel hurtling through air too thin to sustain human life. Thousands of components work in concert: pressurization systems, oxygen distribution, air filtration, temperature control. Any of these systems can fail. When they fail catastrophically, death arrives within seconds. This is not how the airlines prefer to discuss air travel. This is not what they show in commercials. The first indication that something has changed arrives as a subtle shift in David Chen's awareness. He feels it before he understands it, a tightness in his chest, a heaviness in his thoughts, a sense that the world has tilted slightly sideways even though the aircraft remains level. His vision blurs for just a moment. His hands grip the control column, and he realizes he cannot quite remember why he's holding it. "Marcus," he says, and his voice sounds wrong to his own ears, thick, distant, belonging to someone else. "I'm." But the words don't complete. His hand releases the control column. His head tips forward toward the instrument panel. David Chen, whose daughter is waiting for him to coach her soccer game, whose wife made him promise to be careful, whose qualifications and experience and careful attention to detail should carry him through this flight as they have carried him through 8,400 others, tips sideways in his seat. Marcus Webb watches this happen with the kind of slow-motion horror that training never quite prepares you for. He sees the captain's head drop. He sees David's hands go slack. He calls out, "Captain? David?" and receives no response. The radio crackles with approach control calling for a position report that neither pilot is prepared to deliver. Marcus's hands move across the instruments, checking systems, looking for explanation, looking for anything that makes sense. The autopilot shows as engaged. The aircraft maintains altitude. And then Marcus Webb feels it too, that same tightness, that same heaviness, that same sense of the world tilting sideways in a way that should be impossible. He tries to reach for the radio. His arm doesn't quite obey the instruction. He tries to reach for the oxygen controls. The movements feel correct in his mind but disconnected from his body, as if operating through a cable too thick to transmit proper signals. The last thing Marcus Webb perceives before his consciousness dissolves is the thought that something very bad is about to happen to 524 people, and he is no longer capable of preventing it. The autopilot maintains the aircraft's altitude. The engines continue their rhythm. The 777 flies itself through the thin air at 37,000 feet while its pilots slip away from consciousness into a deeper darkness. The flight attendants notice when the intercom notification comes, a series of tones usually reserved for crew communications. Sarah notices too, though her noticing is different from the noticing of people around her. Where others glance up briefly and return to their novels and movies and conversations, Sarah's entire nervous system shifts to alert. She has heard those tones before. She knows what they mean. She knows what triggers them. Her body knows this information even before her conscious mind fully processes it. A flight attendant named Jennifer moves toward the forward galley where the intercom is located. She is trained for countless emergencies, fires, medical events, unruly passengers, turbulence severe enough to rattle the nerves of experienced crews. She is not trained for what she finds when she approaches the cockpit door, rings the bell, and receives no response. She rings again. Nothing. She uses the emergency access code to unlock the door, and her training provides no precedent for what she discovers inside. Both pilots are unconscious. The captain slumps across the center console. The first officer's head has fallen forward onto his chest. The autopilot engages is the only thing maintaining the aircraft in any kind of controlled state. Alarms sound across the flight deck, warnings about systems failing, pressures dropping, conditions deteriorating. The radio crackles with air traffic control calling for the aircraft, receiving nothing but static in response. Jennifer's mind processes emergency escalation in real time. She pulls the cockpit door closed and moves through the cabin with a face that attempts to maintain composure while her voice activates the intercom system. "This is a very unusual request," she says, and her training in voice modulation keeps her tone level, "but we need to locate any pilots currently aboard this aircraft. We need experienced aviators to come to the forward galley immediately. This is not a drill." The cabin processes this announcement through the filter of what such announcements usually mean. Some passengers think it's a joke. Some assume a medical emergency, perhaps not understanding that the intercom's formality indicates something systemic rather than isolated. Some, the ones with aviation knowledge or simple intuition, recognize the particular quality of the request and understand that it means something has gone fundamentally wrong with the aircraft's command structure. Sarah hears the request and experiences the sensation of standing at a doorway she closed deliberately years ago. She knows what the silence from the cockpit means. She knows what those particular alarms mean. She knows the emergency procedures for dual pilot incapacitation, and she knows that those procedures are written for situations where the aircraft carries other crew qualified to intervene. 524 people are now descending from 37,000 feet with no pilots and no margin for error. She experiences a moment of profound internal conflict. She can remain invisible. She can let events proceed according to outcomes determined by chance and circumstance. She can preserve the quiet life she has deliberately constructed. She can tell herself that someone else will respond, that other qualified pilots must be aboard, that her intervention is not actually necessary. She stands up. The movement is quiet. Nobody notices her leaving her seat. The other passengers are occupied with fear or confusion or the particular suspended state that occurs when normal circumstances transform into something unknown. Sarah walks forward with the kind of purposeful calm that suggests she knows exactly where she is going and why, and this confidence itself makes her nearly invisible to notice, a woman who appears to belong in this action, and therefore becomes functionally transparent as people's attention slides over her and focuses on their own panic. She reaches the forward galley where Jennifer still stands, her composed demeanor beginning to crack as she contemplates the implications of the cockpit door remaining closed, of no other pilots stepping forward from the cabin. Sarah speaks quietly, her voice pitched to carry only to Jennifer's ears. "I'm a qualified pilot. I hold captain-level ratings. What's the situation with the crew?" Jennifer stares at her with the particular expression of someone encountering something beyond their frame of reference. This woman, unremarkable and ordinary, is claiming to be a qualified pilot. Jennifer's training includes procedures for many things but does not include verification protocols for random passengers claiming credentials. She steps aside and grants access. The cockpit is exactly as Sarah remembers it being, though this particular 777 is newer than the aircraft she flew. The systems have evolved, but the fundamental principles remain unchanged. David Chen and Marcus Webb lie unconscious in their seats, both breathing, both with pulses, but both entirely incapacitated. Sarah doesn't waste time determining how this happened. The alarms provide information about what has occurred. The instruments show the aircraft beginning a shallow descent as fuel consumption and minor variations in trim begin to push the autopilot's limitations. Sarah moves to the captain's seat and settles into it. Her hands remember this seat. Her body remembers the weight distribution, the angle of the controls, the specific ergonomics of sitting in this position and accepting responsibility for 524 lives. Her mind begins moving through systems checks with the efficiency of someone retrieving procedures stored in muscle memory and neural pathways that never truly forgot, even during years of deliberate distance. She reaches for the radio and keys the transmit button. Her voice comes out level, professional, carrying the cadence of someone who has spent thousands of hours communicating with air traffic control. Boston Center, this is United 447. We have a medical emergency in the flight deck involving both pilots. I am a qualified pilot assuming emergency command of this aircraft. My pilot in command certificate number is. She provides the information. She provides her credentials. She provides her name, and in doing so, she begins the process of shattering the invisibility she has carefully maintained. I will need vectors for emergency descent and landing at the nearest suitable airport. Can you acknowledge? There is a moment of silence while controllers process this transmission. Boston Center has protocols for many situations. They have procedures for declaring emergencies, for communicating with aircraft in distress, for coordinating responses that can mean the difference between catastrophe and controlled outcome. But they do not have procedures for receiving command of an aircraft from a pilot in a passenger seat. The controller, a man named Robert Williams with 22 years of radar experience, hears the transmission and processes both the technical information and the particular quality of the pilot's voice. The transmission contains specific data that only someone with genuine experience could provide. The voice carries the cadence of command-level experience. This woman, whoever she is, possesses the credentials she is claiming. United 447, we acknowledge. We're aware of your situation. We have emergency response being coordinated. Can you confirm current status of the aircraft? Sarah's hands move across the controls, checking systems, confirming that the autopilot is indeed maintaining the aircraft in a relatively stable state despite the alarms indicating progressive system failures. Autopilot engaged. Both flight deck crew are unconscious but breathing. Vital signs appear stable but response is required. I'm beginning descent procedures for emergency landing. What's my nearest airport? Stand by. We're clearing traffic for you. Robert Williams, in a control room 35,000 feet below, begins the process of reshaping a vast volume of airspace to accommodate an emergency that now occupies his entire attention. All other aircraft become peripheral to the situation of United 447. All other concerns become secondary. One woman, sitting in a captain's seat on a passenger jet carrying 524 people, becomes the center point around which the entire Northeast air traffic system begins to pivot. Sarah manages the descent procedures with precision that comes from experience so deeply embedded it operates partly at the level of conscious intention and partly at the level of automatic competence. She reduces power gradually to avoid shock cooling the engines. She coordinates the descent rate to minimize stress on the aircraft's systems. She communicates continuously with Boston Center, providing updates, confirming procedures, confirming that she understands the magnitude of the emergency and that she possesses the expertise required to manage it. The 777 descends through layers of sky. Sarah leaves the cockpit door open so she can communicate with Jennifer and the other flight attendants, providing them with status updates, asking about passenger condition, coordinating emergency procedures that will be required at landing. She tells them to prepare the cabin for a heavy landing, to brief passengers on emergency evacuation procedures, to ensure that nothing will surprise them when touchdown arrives. Her voice remains level throughout these communications. Her hands remain steady on the controls. In the cabin, passengers experience a particular quality of fear that occurs when normal aircraft operations transform into obvious emergency. They hear the announcements about emergency landing procedures. They see flight attendants preparing equipment with a focus that suggests significant concern. The descent feels steeper than normal descent, more purposeful, suggesting that something has disrupted the carefully managed comfort of commercial flight. Some passengers pray. Some hold hands. Some sit in a suspended state between denial and acceptance of outcome that they can no longer control. The 777 continues its descent, passing through 30,000 feet, then 25,000, then gradually working its way down as Sarah manages the descent rate, configures the aircraft for landing, and begins the long process of bringing a massive aircraft safely from sky to ground under circumstances where error is not an option available to her. The Boeing 777 is not designed to be operated by a single pilot. Modern aircraft distribute responsibilities across flight crews specifically because the workload is too complex for one person to manage reliably. Sarah is violating every principle of system design and crew resource management. She is also the only person aboard with the expertise required to prevent catastrophe. Boston Center guides her toward Boston Logan Airport. Ground crews are mobilized. Fire trucks position themselves along the runway. Medical personnel prepare for the possibility of critical injuries. The controller provides guidance about weather conditions, runway configuration, wind speeds, all the information that a pilot needs to make the final calculations of landing an aircraft that now carries the psychological weight of every person aboard's awareness that this landing represents the difference between continuing to live and the alternative outcome they don't want to contemplate. Sarah sees the coastline appear beneath the clouds. She sees the runway lights appear as the aircraft breaks through the cloud layer. Her hands maintain their steady pressure on the controls. Her breathing remains regulated and calm. She feels the weight of 524 people behind her and beneath her, and depending on her expertise and her focus and her ability to execute the procedures she has trained for throughout her career, procedures she has now resurrected from years of deliberate distance. The aircraft touches down at 180 miles per hour. The wheels engage the runway. The reverse thrusters activate, slowing the massive aircraft, bleeding speed as Sarah executes the landing with a precision that surprises even herself, the touch gentle enough that passengers don't realize they've made contact until the deceleration becomes obvious. The 777 slows from landing speed to taxiing speed, moving toward the designated emergency parking area where fire trucks and ambulances wait. Sarah guides the aircraft to the parking spot, reduces the engines to idle, and activates the parking brake. She sits in the captain's seat and allows her breathing to become irregular for the first time since she entered the cockpit. Her hands shake slightly as she reaches for the intercom. This is the captain. We are on the ground safely. Please remain in your seats until we have confirmed that it is safe to deplane. The cabin erupts in relieved chaos, tears, exclamations, the particular emotional release that occurs when danger transforms into safety through the space of a few minutes. Sarah doesn't hear most of it. She is focused on the unconscious pilots, both of whom are beginning to show signs of returning consciousness. David Chen opens his eyes and stares at Sarah with profound confusion. Marcus Webb begins to groan. The medical emergency that incapacitated them seems to be reversing now that the aircraft has descended from 37,000 feet to sea level, the pressure differential perhaps the key factor that induced the unconsciousness in the first place. Emergency response teams enter the aircraft. They extract David and Marcus for medical evaluation. They assess the other passengers for injuries. They begin the process of investigation that will eventually determine that both pilots were exposed to carbon monoxide from a maintenance issue that created a small leak in the auxiliary power unit, a leak that became dangerously concentrated in the flight deck but dispersed through the pressurized cabin sufficiently that passengers were never affected. A tragic accident that might have become a tragedy of epic proportion, prevented by someone who was not supposed to be in position to prevent it. Investigators arrive. Airline personnel arrive. Media begins gathering in the parking lots. Sarah stands in the cockpit, still wearing jeans and a navy sweater, and experiences the sensation of invisibility being burned away by necessity and attention. She is asked questions about her qualifications, her background, her experience. She is asked to describe her procedures. She is asked to explain decisions. She is being extracted from the invisible margins of society and placed into the center of attention where she will remain, whether she wants to be there or not. David Chen, recovering from the carbon monoxide exposure, approaches her once he has been medically cleared. He is shaken, confused, and profoundly grateful. "You saved 524 people," he says. "You saved our lives." Sarah looks at him and feels the weight of something shifting. She has spent 5 years building a life of invisibility, and in the space of 90 minutes, that invisibility has been destroyed by the necessity of preventing catastrophe. She wonders whether she will be able to rebuild it. She wonders whether she wants to rebuild it. She wonders about the life she set aside in exchange for the quiet years in Portland, and whether that exchange continues to make sense now that she has been reminded of who she actually is beneath the careful construction of ordinary appearance. The investigation confirms everything she reported. The media traces her background: former airline captain, military test pilot, exceptional credentials matched only by the exceptional decision she made when crisis demanded that she sacrifice her chosen anonymity. Airlines begin calling, offering positions, offering opportunities to return to an industry she deliberately left. Investigators want to study her decision-making process, her technical expertise, her ability to manage a complex emergency alone. Sarah returns to Maine thinking about what comes next. She has been given her life back, in a way, the recognition of her expertise, the validation of her qualifications, the return to relevance in a field where she had purposefully absented herself. But she has lost the invisibility that she cultivated so carefully. She is no longer a woman who can disappear into the margins of society. She is a woman who saved 524 people, and that action rewrites every story that will be told about her from this point forward. She thinks about David and Marcus, both of whom are recovering well from the carbon monoxide exposure, both of whom have to contend with the knowledge that they were incapacitated in exactly the circumstances they trained for but hoped never to encounter. She thinks about the flight attendants who had to make decisions about whom to trust when asking for pilot volunteers. She thinks about the 524 passengers who will carry the story of that flight for the rest of their lives, the day they were on a plane with no pilots and a stranger who turned out to be a hero. She sits in her apartment in Portland and reads the news stories about her rescue, and she recognizes that the choice to return to visibility was never actually a choice at all. The moment she stood up in seat 14C and walked toward the cockpit, she surrendered any realistic hope of disappearing back into the invisibility she had maintained. The moment she identified herself to Boston Center, she began the process of dismantling a life that had seemed sustainable 5 years earlier but that she now understands was always incomplete. The hospital releases David Chen and Marcus Webb within hours of landing. Both men recover quickly from carbon monoxide exposure, and both experience the particular disorientation of finding themselves unconscious while their aircraft carried nearly 500 people through emergency procedures they did not execute. They learn about Sarah from news reports and emergency debriefings, the woman in seat 14C, the retired captain who pulled them out of catastrophe. David calls her that evening, his voice carrying the emotional vulnerability of a man confronting his own mortality through the actions of someone he has never met. "I don't know how to thank you," David says, and Sarah hears the tremor in his voice that comes from understanding how close the margin actually was. "If you hadn't been on that flight," he doesn't complete the sentence. He doesn't need to. Sarah understands the mathematics of probability and consequence. She understands what happens to 524 people if she remains in seat 14C, invisible and quiet, when crisis demands that she become visible and certain. "You would have found someone," Sarah tells him, though she doesn't actually believe this. She knows the odds. She knows how many pilots are flying on any given day. She knows how unlikely it is that 2 qualified captains would have been aboard United 447 on that particular afternoon. "No," David says quietly. "I don't think we would have." The conversation ends. Sarah sits with her phone and contemplates the weight of that acknowledgement, that she was not interchangeable with someone else, that her specific expertise in that specific moment carried significance that cannot be diminished through false modesty or redirect toward other possibilities that never actually existed. The investigation into the maintenance failure takes weeks. Investigators trace the problem to a corroded connector in the auxiliary power unit that allowed carbon monoxide to leak into the flight deck ventilation system. They calculate exposure levels and determine that the pilots would have lost consciousness within minutes of the leak becoming significant. They examine Sarah's procedures and find them not just correct but optimally executed under circumstances that permit no margin for error. Their final report becomes a study in emergency decision-making, in the application of expertise under impossible constraints, in the particular burden carried by people whose capabilities make them essential in catastrophic moments. Media coverage cycles through waves: initial awe at the rescue, then detailed analysis of Sarah's background, then speculation about whether she would return to commercial aviation. News vans camp outside her apartment building. Reporters call her phone constantly. Her yoga instructor recognizes her and feels an obligation to acknowledge her prominence. The volunteer work at the Maritime Museum becomes complicated when visitors recognize her and shift their attention from exhibits to her presence. Invisibility has been completely and permanently destroyed. Sarah's daughter, Emma, calls from California. She is 26 years old, an architect designing buildings in San Francisco, a person whose own life has proceeded without depending on daily maternal presence for years. Emma has seen the news, has watched her mother's quiet life explode into public recognition, has experienced the strange sensation of suddenly seeing her mother as the world sees her, someone exceptional, someone whose expertise extends to things Emma never fully understood during her childhood. "Mom," Emma says, "what are you going to do?" Sarah realizes she doesn't have an answer yet. She has moved through the immediate aftermath of the emergency, through the investigations and debriefings, through the media attention and the phone calls from airlines and aviation organizations. She has preserved the shape of her quiet life in Maine even as that life has become fundamentally altered by exposure and recognition. But Emma's question demands that she think about what comes next, not in the immediate future but in the architecture of her life going forward. "I don't know," Sarah tells her daughter honestly. "I haven't decided yet." "You saved 524 people," Emma says. "That's not nothing. You shouldn't just pretend it didn't happen." After the call ends, Sarah considers her daughter's perspective with the particular clarity that comes from people who know you best. Emma spent 3 years watching her mother sacrifice an entire career identity for the commitment to be present during chemotherapy and recovery. Emma has now grown into a woman who doesn't need that daily presence, whose life has proceeded without that maternal infrastructure, whose survival no longer depends on her mother's daily attention. Emma is saying something that Sarah has been avoiding, that the reasons for maintaining invisibility no longer apply with the same force they did 5 years earlier. The airline's offer becomes more formal. They send representatives to Portland, they offer specific contract terms, they discuss captain positions and seniority and the prospect of a returning pilot whose expertise has been proven under circumstances that no simulator can fully replicate. Sarah sits across from a vice president of pilot operations who explains that her actions have actually increased her value as a pilot, that having successfully managed a 777 alone in emergency conditions has created a particular kind of credibility that cannot be manufactured through any other means. "We would be honored to have you return," the vice president says, and Sarah hears the sincerity beneath the corporate language. "Your expertise is exactly what aviation needs, experienced pilots who understand the weight of responsibility and the necessity of flawless execution." Sarah thinks about sitting in the captain's seat during descent into Boston Logan. She thinks about how her hands remembered the procedures despite years of distance. She thinks about how the expertise she maintained through charter flying in simulator time and the theoretical study of systems she no longer flew professionally has prepared her for exactly this moment, managing a 777 alone while 524 people depended on her precise execution of procedures learned years earlier. She thinks about the alternative, remaining in Portland, maintaining the quiet life that has become untenable now that her identity has been revealed, pretending that she can rebuild invisibility when everyone now knows who she is and what she is capable of. She thinks about being 70 years old and contemplating whether she made the right choice by refusing to use the expertise that defines who she actually is. Sarah's hands tremble slightly as she signs the contract that will return her to commercial aviation as a captain with United Airlines. She will undergo recurrent training, will participate in simulator sessions to refresh her procedures on modern aircraft systems, will gradually return to active pilot status. She will sit in captain seats and manage 777s carrying hundreds of people across oceans and continents. She will use the expertise that 5 years of deliberately chosen invisibility could not diminish. The invisible woman in seat 14C has been permanently transformed into a visible woman taking captain's seat in the flight deck. Sarah Mitchell, retired captain turned reluctant hero turned committed professional, returns to the sky not as a passenger but as the person she has always actually been beneath the careful construction of ordinariness and deliberate anonymity. She understands now that some people cannot choose invisibility in the end, not when they possess expertise that 524 people need to survive, not when their capabilities make them essential to catastrophe prevention, not when crisis has revealed that ordinary appearance conceals extraordinary capacity. Sarah packs her apartment in Portland, arranges her schedule around pilot training, and prepares for a future that will now be lived with full acknowledgement of who she actually is and what she is actually capable of achieving. The sky awaits her return, and this time she will not attempt to hide from it. Sarah begins her recurrent training at the United Pilot Training Facility in Denver 6 weeks after the emergency landing in Boston. The simulators are more advanced than anything she trained on during her original career, the technology has evolved significantly, and the procedures reflect lessons learned from accidents and near misses accumulated over the years since she last sat in a 777 captain's seat. Her instructor is a man named Robert Patterson, a former military pilot who transitioned to commercial aviation and now trains pilots for situations that exceed most people's capacity to imagine. He has read the reports about United 447. He knows who Sarah is. He approaches her with the particular respect reserved for pilots who have actually managed the situations that most pilots only encounter in simulators. "Your instincts were correct on the Boston landing," Robert tells her during their first session. "I've reviewed the flight data. Your descent rate management, your energy management, your coordination with ground control, it was textbook emergency procedure executed under circumstances where textbook procedure was impossible. Most pilots never face what you faced. Most pilots who face it don't survive it." Sarah experiences a particular quality of validation in this assessment. She has spent 5 years wondering whether her expertise had degraded during years away from active flying. She has questioned whether her decision-making process had deteriorated. Robert's evaluation confirms that the expertise she maintained through charter operations and theoretical study has remained sharp, that her ability to manage complex aircraft under catastrophic circumstances has not deteriorated despite the years of distance from commercial flying. The training progresses through increasingly complex scenarios. Sarah sits in the simulator as engines fail, as hydraulic systems cascade, as weather deteriorates into conditions that push the 777 toward its structural limits. She manages problems alone and with full crews. She practices recovery procedures from unusual attitudes, from complete system failures, from the particular nightmare scenarios that simulator training exists to prepare pilots for. She is rated not as a returning captain but as an exceptionally proficient pilot whose experience extends beyond what most commercial pilots ever accumulate. During a break between training sessions, Sarah visits the memorial garden that United Airlines maintains for pilots and crew members lost in aviation accidents. The garden is quiet and respectful, containing plaques and stones commemorating people who died doing the job that Sarah has chosen to return to. She reads names and dates, contemplates the particular burden of knowing that aviation, for all its safety records and redundant systems, remains fundamentally risky. She thinks about David Chen and Marcus Webb, who might have been names on these stones if circumstances had proceeded differently. She thinks about the 524 passengers who might have been commemorated in accidents reports and victim memorials if she had remained invisible in seat 14C. The weight of this consideration settles on her shoulders with the permanence of responsibility she has now accepted. By choosing to return to aviation, by choosing to sit in captain's seats, she is choosing to accept ongoing responsibility for managing risks that can never be completely eliminated. She is choosing to become the person who holds 524 lives in her hands every time she takes command of an aircraft. She is choosing to be visible as the person capable of managing catastrophe, which means accepting that catastrophe remains possible. Sarah completes her recurrent training with scores that place her in the top percentile of returning pilots. She is assigned to a pilot base in Boston, which means she will operate from the airport where she landed United 447 in emergency. This assignment carries a particular quality of symmetry. She will spend her career launching from the same airport where she saved 524 people, will pass through the same terminal where media crowded looking for interviews, will inhabit the same professional space where her actions transformed aviation operations for an entire facility. Her first commercial flight as returning captain is scheduled for 6 months after the emergency landing, a domestic route from Boston to Miami carrying 312 passengers and a crew that includes David Chen, who requested specifically to fly with Sarah on her return to active captain status. David has also completed recurrent training following the carbon monoxide exposure, and both pilots understand that their first flight together carries particular significance. They are consciously choosing to work together again, choosing to trust each other, choosing to return to normal operations despite having experienced circumstances that many pilots would never recover from. On the morning of the flight, Sarah arrives at Boston Logan Airport 2 hours before departure. She walks through the terminal and experiences the strange quality of seeing familiar spaces transformed by her changed status. She is no longer invisible. People recognize her from news coverage. People approach her to thank her, to tell her that they were passengers on United 447, to express gratitude that has accumulated over months of media coverage and investigation reports. Sarah receives this attention with graciousness while maintaining the professional demeanor that separates personal response from captain's responsibilities. She meets David in the crew room. They shake hands with the formality that covers genuine connection, two pilots returning to normal operations after experiencing circumstances that exceeded normal parameters. They walk to the 777 together, conduct the pre-flight inspection, verify systems, prepare the aircraft for operation. The familiarity of these procedures is profound. Sarah's hands remember the sequence, her mind recalls the specific checks, her body operates from memory that extends across years of distance into expertise that has never actually diminished. The flight departs on schedule. Sarah commands the aircraft with the same precision she demonstrated during emergency descent into Boston, calm, methodical, executing procedures with the kind of flawless attention that comes from pilots who understand the weight of responsibility and the necessity of maintaining absolute focus. The flight proceeds without incident. The weather cooperates. The systems function normally. The 312 passengers experience an unremarkable flight, exactly what commercial aviation is designed to provide. During cruise, Sarah and David occupy the same flight deck where carbon monoxide nearly killed them both months earlier. They discuss the emergency with the particular perspective that only people who have actually experienced it can bring. David tells Sarah about nightmares he experienced during recovery, about moments when he questioned whether he could continue flying commercially, about the gradual process of rebuilding confidence in systems and procedures he had taken for granted. Sarah shares her own experience of distance and return, of the 5 years of invisibility that preceded the emergency, of the conscious choice to reclaim an identity she had deliberately set aside. "I'm grateful you were on that flight," David tells her during the conversation. "Not just because you saved us, but because you chose to come back. You could have remained invisible. You could have let the aftermath settle and returned to your quiet life. You chose to become visible again." Sarah considers this observation with the particular clarity that comes from people who truly understand. She has chosen to return not just to flying but to visibility, to the ongoing burden of being recognized as someone whose expertise makes her essential, to the permanent transformation of her life from quiet retirement to active professional engagement. She has chosen to sit in captain's seats and accept responsibility for managing risks that cannot be completely eliminated. She has chosen to be the person who responds when 524 people are depending on her expertise and determination. The flight continues toward Miami. Sarah manages the descent with the same precision she brought to the emergency landing months earlier. The 777 touches down smoothly. The passengers disembark without realizing they have been commanded by the woman who saved 524 people on a flight from Boston months earlier. Sarah parks the aircraft, completes post-flight procedures, and contemplates the quiet satisfaction of a normal flight executed with professionalism and expertise. This is her life now, not invisible but visible, not retired but actively engaged, not hiding from capability but embracing it. This is what 524 people bought when they depended on her expertise during emergency. This is the price and the privilege of being someone whose skills make her essential in catastrophic moments. Sarah removes her captain's uniform and prepares for the next flight, understanding that invisibility is forever gone and that the choice to become visible was the only choice she could actually make. Emma arrives in Boston to watch her mother's first flight as a returning captain. She sits in the terminal, observing people approaching Sarah for photos and autographs, watching her mother sign certificates from passengers on United 447, witnessing the particular transformation of someone from invisible margins into recognized prominence. Emma feels a complex mix of pride and something else, the recognition that her mother's sacrifice during her chemotherapy years, the years when Sarah chose presence over career, have now been supplanted by a different kind of commitment. Emma understands that this shift is necessary, that her mother cannot remain invisible after proving what she is capable of, that some people are fundamentally unable to retreat from expertise once crisis has revealed it. After the Miami flight, Sarah and Emma have dinner in a restaurant overlooking Boston Harbor. They discuss the flight, the sensation of returning to active flying, the weight of managing 312 passengers with the same calm focus that Sarah brought to 524 people during emergency. Emma tells her mother that she watched the flight tracking online, that she knew exactly where the aircraft was throughout the journey, that she experienced the particular anxiety of having a parent whose job involves managing risks across vast distances at extreme altitudes. "Are you scared?" Emma asks her mother. "Flying this much?" Sarah considers the question with the honesty that has always defined their relationship. "Yes," she says. "But I'm more scared of not doing this. I spent 5 years trying to be invisible. I spent 5 years pretending that expertise I maintained no longer mattered. But 524 people showed me that invisibility is a privilege, it's only available to people whose skills nobody depends on. Once people depend on you, once you've proven that you're capable of managing catastrophe, invisibility becomes a form of abandonment." Emma listens to her mother's explanation and understands something about the particular burden carried by people whose capabilities make them essential. She understands that her mother cannot choose invisibility anymore, cannot retreat into quiet retirement, cannot pretend that the 5 years in Maine represented her actual future. Sarah has been transformed by necessity into someone she cannot unchoose, a visible expert whose expertise matters in ways that affect hundreds of lives on every flight. "I'm proud of you," Emma tells her mother. "I was proud of you for staying home during my treatment. But I'm also proud of you for coming back. For choosing to use what you know instead of hiding from it." Sarah reaches across the table and squeezes her daughter's hand. She understands that Emma has given her permission to reclaim an identity that motherhood temporarily required her to set aside. She understands that her daughter has grown into someone who doesn't need daily maternal presence, whose life has proceeded without depending on that infrastructure, whose own future will not be constrained by her mother's professional choices. The evening ends with both women understanding that transformation is complete. Sarah Mitchell, retired captain, emergency hero, and now active commercial pilot, has reclaimed her identity not as an alternative to motherhood but as an extension of the same commitment to excellence that defined her presence during her daughter's crisis. She is visible, engaged, and permanently changed by the necessity of saving 524 people. She is exactly who she needed to become.